Long-time researcher with the Pear Lab, and I think he's also a constructor of REGs. So, John.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk today about consilience in my-matter interaction. As you can see, I'm going to anchor it very much on random event generator experiments, but then I'm going to try to link it back to remote viewing, healing, some of the other phenomena that people have brought up, with the hopes that that will allow us to better build on the consilience theme and think about what might be in common across these phenomena. So about me, I don't want to spend too much detail on it. We had an intro. I think probably the most interesting part here, aside from the fact that Bob, John, and Brenda Dunn saved me from conventional education by exposing me to the pair work before I went to college, is the fact that along with Herb Mertz and the pair guys and some of our other friends from around here, we started this organization called Sileron, which made random event generator devices with the goal of just getting them out into the public so that people could conduct more experiments. And of course, in the process of doing that, we ran plenty of our own experiments. Herb, who you guys have heard from before and has a book coming out, spent several thousand hours literally using the REG himself and trying to document what his training process and feelings were like. And basically, it was just a really good vantage point to understand what different experimenters were finding in addition to what we were doing. So I think it was unique and pretty positive experience. What I'm going to do here now is talk about the REG. I'm always a little bit in trouble because I recognize that half of the audience is pretty familiar with this stuff, at least at a high level. And it looks like we have a lot of new people this year who don't even know how the experiments work. So I'm going to try to balance that. It's hard in the 20 minutes, but hopefully Harold and Bill will keep me on track, and I'll do it quickly enough and coherently enough that it makes sense. So I'm also going to cheat. Actually, I'm not. What I'm going to do is I'll give you the 10-second overview on what the random event generator is. So it's a physical device that connects to the computer. This is pretty simplified, but just think of it as an electronic coin tosser where the coins that are being tossed are based on some kind of underlying process that, generally speaking, quantum physics says are fundamentally random. So it could be something like electrons tunneling in a field effect transistor. It could be something like radioactively decaying molecule triggering a timer. There's sort of a long list of things. It doesn't really matter, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But basically, let's just imagine there's a little particle. If it goes one way, we're going to call it a 0 bit, like this little up arrow. Or I'm sorry, we'll call it a 1 bit if it goes up. We'll call it a 0 bit if it goes the other way. And what we're going to do is we're going to have people sit down in front of a computer, and they're going to say ahead of time, all right, I'm going to watch a line on the screen, and I want this device to produce more 1 bits. So I want to make the line go up, let's say. They'll do that. We'll do it a few thousand times. We'll collect a lot of different data from the different operators. And in the end, we get an effect that looks, not always, of course, I'm picking some of the best data from the Pair Lab, but you get an effect that looks like this. So for this operator, when they were trying to make the output of this device go up, it went up. When they were trying to make it go down, it went down. And when they were, you can debate how they took the baseline instruction, but it kind of stayed in the center. If the random event generator was behaving the way that classical physics thinks it should behave, this shouldn't happen. I mean, there should be no reason why a physical device responds or behaves differently based on a person looking at it and having an intention one way or the other. So this is sort of the tip of the iceberg. The reason I wanted to bring it up in the consilience conversation, and again, I'm going to try to keep myself under control here because it's easy to go into a lot of detail. But basically, I'm going to argue over the course of this that what we find with the random event generator phenomena is actually not at all different from what we find in most of these other types of psi phenomena, but that actually, and I'm going to refer to it as mind-matter interaction phenomena. I actually hate that phrase because I think it embeds a kind of dualism that's probably really wrong, but it's the only convenient way to talk about it, so we're going to have to do that. But basically, the reason I really like these things is that you're starting with a physical device where the output, you understand the theoretical properties of its output very well, and you can empirically test them and confirm that that's true super easily. It's also very resilient against interference, so these things are intentionally designed so that pretty much no matter what you do in the physical environment to the device or around the device, it's not going to do anything to change the output. So if the output is indeed changed in the direction of intention like we talked about, you can presuppose that at least insofar as we understand other conventional physical effects, it's not one of those. Similarly, while I have participated in and enjoy conducting experiments in a lot of other psi phenomena, whether it's remote viewing or pre-sentiment or any of these other things, telepathy, you get into trouble because even if you get a great effect, people always want to say, well, the person sitting across from you must have unconsciously wiggled their eyeball, and that let you know that the card was, X. So there's this notion of human-to-human interference or human-to-human information transfer that's happening non-anomalously, which you essentially rule out if you're going to use something like a random event generator. So if a human is interfering with the random event generator, that's great because they're not supposed to be able to physically do that. So, we're fine. Let me just also say, because you're using software to run these experimental protocols, it's very easy to control and make as robust. You can make it flexible or not flexible or pre-specify your experimental conditions however you want, which is pretty helpful. And of course, you can do these experiments in 5 minutes, 5 hours, 5 months. It just depends on how much data you want to generate, how good your operators are, and that kind of thing. So let's jump ahead. We talked about the pair data. I'll give Herb a plug for his book. He has a book called The Selection Effect that's coming out. This is his data. So I would say the difference between Herb and the prior data, hopefully he won't get too mad at me, was that he started out not feeling like he was necessarily great at this, but he wanted to learn and train and work on it. And in the end, he was able to generate some pretty significant effects. So there's a lot of other stuff we did with REGs aside from the normal pair lab type of phenomena. I think this gets important to understand because there are some things that are buried in the fact that the REG does what it does. For example, the Mind Lamp, which a few people have already mentioned, is a device that it's basically a lamp that's usually white, and then at any given time, based on the random event generator output, it can jump to one of 8 colors. So maybe it jumps red, maybe it jumps green, maybe it goes blue. You sort of have no idea. So you don't know when it's going to be triggered or what color it's going to go to, but there are well-defined statistical distributions around both. So if Bankston over here sits down in front of it and says, I want to make the lamp turn red, the hope or the expectation, if he's generating this type of effect, would be that the lamp would ideally turn red instantly. Maybe it will, maybe it won't, but at a minimum, it would turn red more often than it turns the other colors relative to what you'd expect by chance. The reason that's important is because, just to step back for a second, Bill Bankston, our operator, doesn't know anything about what's actually happening inside that device to make the thing turn red. Bill Bankston's not sitting there for 2 years training on how to make the lamp turn red. There seems to be something about this phenomena, just like when the line is going up or down with the REG, the person doesn't actually know anything about the photons or the electrons or the radioactive decay process or whatever you're using, but there is some way in which the intention seems to be able to map itself onto what needs to happen in the physical process in order to get the intended result. So this is by itself a kind of teleology that's pretty at odds with the way we think about standard mechanistic causality in most of science. Similarly, we've got another process, project, experiment, whatever you want to call it. You guys can look at some of my earlier talks on this if you haven't heard it. There's a thing called syntax where the random event generator basically decides to send you a message to your cell phone. And so the timing of the message it sends you and what it sends you are random. There's a quote-unquote random, right? From a conventional paradigm, they're random. But as far as this kind of phenomena goes, it would be driven by this mind-matter interaction effect. So you see a lot of interesting things. For example, when I gave the first talk about syntax, describing what it did and why we made it, it was actually an SSE talk, I believe it was in 2009. I described the fact that one of the reasons we went forward with the project was because it would often send me a message that says, I know you're thinking about me, while I was thinking about it. Well, while I was giving that talk, I looked at my phone afterwards, and I had the message. So it is kind of cool because I didn't tell anyone, I didn't mention it during the talk. But you get these sort of interesting interconnected patterns in terms of the output that you're getting from the device, the psychological meaning, et cetera. There's some other experiments like field reg. Don't want to go into those. I do want to quickly highlight that as far as the REG phenomena go overall, there are a lot of kind of conventional engineering type questions that people wanted to ask. The Paralab people spent a ton of time on this. Is the effect dependent on distance? Is it dependent on time? If I'm closer or farther, does the effect fall off? Again, I can talk about any of this in significant detail if anybody wants to, but I think the basic answer is distance doesn't matter. Now that we have the internet, we do these things thousands of miles away sometimes. It makes no difference. The time stuff is always hard to talk about and communicate to people, but you can clearly, and I'm not the only one who's done these experiments, look at Helmut Schmidt's work, going back to the 80s. You can, if you're the first one observing the data, it seems pretty clear that people can influence data that was already pre-recorded and get basically the same effect that they get otherwise, which has, again, huge knock-on effects and implications for other phenomena in this field. I already made this point that there's sort of, it's somewhat mechanism agnostic, both in terms of it seems like almost any quote-unquote quantum random process is susceptible to this. The operator doesn't have to know what exactly they're trying to influence. And again, huge variety of physical phenomena that all seem to be able to be influenced by this effect. The other thing is, again, goals, right? So when you're using syntax, you don't necessarily have an explicit goal to make it, send you message A versus message B. But in some experiments, you do. It may be my goal that when I go to the gym, I want the syntax to send me a message that says work harder. If you really think about how many steps would be involved in that process to map that sort of mental intention through to hitting a specific random event generator that's sitting on a server in Florida at a particular moment in time when it's running the algorithm that's tied to my account, et cetera, it's actually quite amazing that these effects work at all. Subjectively, on the operator side of this, it's not worth spending that much time on it, but you hear things that are a lot like what you hear in most SIRE mind matter phenomena. People will have something like beginner's luck. There are certain people who seem to be better at it than others, but it also seems to be the case that when people do this unconsciously pretty well, there's a long list of experiments where the random event generator is driving something, and then people are just engaged in regular social behavior, but with the REG driving an outcome that's positive or negative for them in that context, and you actually see somewhat interesting results. Anyway, don't want to go crazy. We need to switch to Consilience. So I thought York did a great job of outlining, he kind of beat me to it, but he did a great job of outlining and combining a whole bunch of different categories of anomalies. I wanted to focus just on the ones that relate to the so-called mind-matter interaction, and I was trying to draw from work that SSE people have done. Again, just in interest of time, I'm not going to be able to kind of give all of the details and references and credit to people that I would like to. But what I do want to do is to highlight some of them at a high level, and then say, Bankston also jumped me on this, but that's fine. I started with a framework called mapping the anomalies, right? So people generally think of the REG phenomena as, okay, there's a box right out there, and I'm going to influence it with my mind. So there's this idea, I joke that people think there's like a laser beam coming out of their brain, hitting the REG, and that somehow makes this process happen. So I would say that's the default thinking that people have. If you thought about some phenomena, like large-scale telekinesis, levitation, any of that, you'd say, okay, well, that's probably a physics-like energy effect, and it's probably an influence, right? Because your chair doesn't decide on its own to jump or something. On the other hand, if you took something like remote viewing, on this 2x2, I've got sort of energy-like, information-like, influencing versus receiving. You could say that the purest form of remote viewing is something like, okay, I'm trying to figure out what's happening to my cousin in Pennsylvania right now. Well, if I do that, you could say, well, I'm just trying to receive information here. There's not necessarily an influence. Don't take anything that I put on this map seriously. It's just meant to be conceptual. And the real reason is, and again, I want to be careful with the time, the reason is I think what we can do is we can systematically go through pretty much every anomaly, and we can show why it doesn't actually make sense to use this kind of framework, and that I think that will actually tell us a lot about what's going on. But just to give people the flavor a little bit, so we could take this other experiment at Pair called the random mechanical cascade. So here you had a series of, they would call them precision engineered polystyrene spheres, if I have it correct, but I'm just going to call them balls. And the balls drop from the ceiling. They hit a peg. Each time they hit a peg, they bounce. And at the end of the day, the device is supposed to have a distribution that looks like one of these nice standard Gaussian distributions. But instead of like the REG, where you're trying to influence the line on the screen to go up or down, here you're trying to influence the balls to go left or right. And basically, you get a very similar effect. The only point that I want to make is now that we're talking about balls instead of electrons in a semiconductor, is this an energy effect? Is this an information effect? Am I influencing the wind? Who knows? I'm just not sure, but I know that I've got this effect. If we go to the information sensing experiments, you guys know about most of this. We've got the telepathy experiments. There's a problem with telepathy, or depending on what your experimental setup, there's always an issue of who's actually sending and receiving. And I think remote viewing is particularly good this way. If you look at all of the different remote viewing protocols, you've got versions where you're sending out an agent, and then there's a percipient who's trying to guess what the agent saw. Well, who's actually sending what to who in that situation? You also have versions where there is no other person. I'm trying to perceive an event. You have a situation where I'm trying, Dale Greff will probably talk about this later. He's going to dream and try to figure out what's going to be on tomorrow's newspaper. Well, how is that happening? What's going on there? Healing and biological effects, Bill talked about this a lot, so there's really not that much to say. I just want to say that there are traditions that talk about energy healing and vibes and locality, electromagnetic fields, et cetera. But then you've got other versions which seem to be non-local, where you seem to have effects that scale in ways that, as Bill was describing, wouldn't necessarily make sense under an energy paradigm. Synchronicity, synchronicity is another one of these interesting ones. I'm not even sure exactly what to call it or how to describe it, but the point that I just want to make is you've got things like the syntax situation that I described earlier, which is actually pretty easy to explain without synchronicity or anything else, because you could make the claim, if you wanted to, that perhaps, oh, well, John's just really good at influencing the REG. He influenced the REG while he was talking, so he'd have a cool story to tell people for the years to come. But in reality, it's a lot more complicated because we don't actually, given the retrocausation and everything else, we don't know when did I influence it, did I influence it, et cetera. But you get other things, like, for example, I did a remote viewing experiment at one point, just kind of as a side thing with some friends. There was this issue that came up where we were trying to draw this pineapple here. There's an inordinate amount of backing and forthing on it for a while. This went on for maybe 36 hours on and off. I was then in a final meeting talking about the experiment, and my wife sent me a picture that she just went to the doctor's office and got this. They saw this there. So this is not, it doesn't mean anything. I have no idea. It's just, the point though is that if you were to try to diagram out, what are the mechanisms that could make this happen, you could say something like, well, maybe my wife was feeling bored and wanted some attention, and she was like, all right, I'm going to psychically locate a pineapple that matches this. That's one explanation. Maybe not. Maybe the person who picked this out of the jar somehow picked this as a random target, knew something about what we were going to bump into, and that would create an interesting effect. We just don't know. I'm going to skip the telekinesis. People have seen this. There's some great work last year. Skip that. Just want to also point out that so you can basically take any of these, and I don't know that I've been that convincing. We'd have to go systematically through all of it. But even with something like the REG experiment, you don't know that you're actually influencing anything. It could be that you just showed up at exactly the right time to run the experiment, such that when you conducted that trial, that was the trial in the superposition of possible REG outcomes that gets you the result that corresponds with your intention. I've done some of the calculations around this, and there's a lot of ways in which your experimental setup matters a lot. But basically, it's pretty hard to distinguish, unless you purposely design your experiment to try to exclude it. And to me, it's not clear that it matters. Jumping ahead, so just showing that you can have a completely different mapping. At the end of the day, you can put all of this stuff anywhere, almost. Don't want to go too overboard and say it's really anywhere, but it almost kind of is. So what do we do about that? We have these phenomena. They could really fit anywhere on the map. We don't know if they're information. We don't know if it's energy. We don't know about senders and receivers and all of these things. I'm going to just highlight a few principles. You can decide to agree with me or not. It'll probably annoy a lot of people depending on what kind of anomalies you study. But I'm going to say the first principle is simplification. Like, it can't be that complicated that there are 56 different phenomena out there. In the one case, it's it's this particular vibration of energy that does X, but then in the other case, somebody else who's creating the exact same healing effect is using a different one, and they can do it non-locally, whereas the other person can only do it locally, and this one can do it backwards in time, but can't do it forwards in time, et cetera. I think we need to just kind of hone in on, there's probably one process or something that we want to think about. The second point is that I believe in I'll call it the principle of largest effects. It's not a good way to really talk about it, but because there's such a diversity of quote-unquote skill and effect sizes in this field, and because I didn't talk about this much, but we have huge experimenter effects and other things that those of us who work with this a lot are very familiar with. If person A does an experiment and they find out, oh, okay, REGs can be influenced, but only on a full moon on Tuesday, and person B does it and says, well, you know what, I can influence at any time as long as the participant is female. You add all these things up, I think you have to take kind of the broadest set of effects. So if it turns out that there's somebody who's getting huge effect sizes non-locally and doing all these other things, you should probably assume, all right, the effect works non-locally and has these characteristics. I think whatever we do here, we want it to be compatible with regular science. I'll probably end up ending here. I just wanted to say that this is not that exciting of a summary, but I would say that the commonality across all of these is that you have some kind of stochastic process that has, I'll just call it sufficient degrees of freedom to be effective. We can debate what that means. There's some kind of need or expectation or intent on the behalf of some mind. It could be a group mind. It could be an individual mind. There is, I think, and Amant's got at this a little bit, and it's come up in Bill's experiments with the mice. I don't think it makes sense to think in terms of physical space-time, distance and time. Herb and I sometimes use the word associative space. You need to think about a space of relationship. So for example, if I'm trying to influence an REG that's 6,000 miles from here, I might not even know that it's 6,000 miles from here. How is it that my intention is the thing that quote-unquote influences it and gives me the effect? The million people in the city around it who don't know about it have no impact whatsoever. I think it's important to think about an alternative type of spaces. I also think, I've talked about how senders versus receivers, not really a productive way of looking at things. I think in any given experiment, you can select a context that defines a person as a sender or a receiver. But in reality, there's probably a lot of situations where these two minds, or whatever they are, could be a mind and an object, are sort of entangled in a way that makes them somewhat more indistinguishable. You saw that a bit with Bill's work. And then finally, I'm cheating with a tautology, and I'm not going to have any time to explain it, but I just want to say hard things are harder, or harder things are hard. And so the idea here is that when you look across the spectrum of anomalies, I think the more sort of improbable the result is, the harder it is to get, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a different effect or a different phenomena. And my only major implication was just learn to be good at the effect and stop worrying about all this other stuff. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We have time for questions. Maybe 2 or 3.
With REGs, something I've been curious about, and I think you're the guy to answer it. Okay. Someone who can afford to have 5 or 10 or 50 professional REGs in the same room, has there been non-local experiments done? Like do a whole bunch of REGs on the same table, yep. Behave the same for someone trying to influence them?
So we've never done that. I know other people who have, and I'm also a little bit theoretically biased on this, but given what we've seen with a lot of different effects, my guess is they won't, except in the case where you have an experimenter who's wanting to find that, in which case I expect that you'll end up with a z-score showing something in line with whatever that experimenter's capacity is as an individual operator. So it will show a local physical effect with more REGs to the extent that that experimenter is able to generate that.
Okay, appears you have been very clear, no questions.
I don't know about that, but thank you.
Thank you for this session. Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody. We come back